You think she even understands what real intelligence sounds like? The sentence landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Conversation stalled. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to waiting lips. The soft glow of imported chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors, while a string quartet played somewhere beyond the private dining hall, unaware that a single careless remark had just changed the course of the evening. High above downtown Chicago, on the 42nd floor of one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, billionaires, venture capitalists, and technology executives gathered around a curved walnut table overlooking miles of glittering skyline. The dinner was supposed to celebrate the final stage of a merger rumored to be worth nearly $800 million. Instead, it was becoming something else entirely. At the center of the room sat Adrian Cole, the celebrated CEO of Cole Dynamics. At 39, he was known as the man who could turn failing companies into global giants. His charcoal suit fit perfectly. His silver watch cost more than many Americans earned in a year. People laughed when he laughed. They nodded when he spoke. Power followed him the way shadows follow light. Across from him sat a delegation of international investors speaking quietly among themselves in a mixture of English, Japanese, and Mandarin. Adrian listened with growing impatience. He hated not understanding every conversation in a room he believed belonged to him. Moving silently between tables was Maya Johnson, a 26-year-old black waitress working her third double shift that week. Her uniform was spotless despite the long hours. Her posture remained straight despite the ache in her feet. Most guests never noticed her beyond the moment they needed water refilled or a plate removed. Maya had grown accustomed to that kind of invisibility. In rooms filled with wealth, people often saw the tray before they saw the person carrying it. But what no one at the table knew was that Maya collected languages the way other people collected souvenirs. She had spent years teaching herself through public libraries, secondhand textbooks, free online lectures, and endless late-night practice sessions after work. Knowledge had become her refuge long before it became her strength. Adrian leaned back in his chair and smirked as one of the investors spoke rapidly in Japanese. "I wonder if she thinks we're discussing the menu," he joked loudly, glancing toward Maya as she poured sparkling water into a crystal glass. A few nervous laughs circled the table. Others looked away. They recognized arrogance when they heard it, but power often made honesty expensive. Maya continued pouring without reacting. Not because she had not heard him, because she had. Every word. The investor paused briefly, exchanging a glance with a colleague before continuing the conversation. Adrian chuckled. "Maybe we should start conducting all negotiations in foreign languages. At least then nobody outside the deal could follow along." The laughter came easier this time. Maya felt the familiar sting of being reduced to a stereotype, a background figure in someone else's story. Yet her expression never changed. She simply carried the empty bottle away and returned moments later with another. The city lights beyond the windows shimmered like scattered diamonds across Lake Michigan. The room remained elegant, refined, controlled. But beneath the surface, something was shifting. The investors continued discussing technical details regarding a proprietary artificial intelligence platform. Numbers moved back and forth. Timelines were debated. Risks were evaluated. Then one executive mentioned a translation error buried inside a draft contract. It seemed minor. Most people barely noticed. Maya did. She stopped for half a second beside the table. Her pulse quickened. Her eyes moved toward the document lying near Adrian's hand. A single mistranslated phrase had completely altered the meaning of a key clause. If left unchanged, the mistake could cost someone hundreds of millions of dollars. She hesitated, not because she doubted herself, because she understood exactly what happened to people who spoke up in rooms where they were never invited to have a voice. Around her, glasses clinked softly. Silverware touched fine china. The skyline glowed beyond the glass walls. And for the first time that night, Maya realized that remaining silent might be the most expensive mistake anyone in the room could make. Maya kept walking. One step, then another. The polished floor reflected the amber light above her as she carried an empty tray toward the service station. But the sentence she had just heard refused to leave her mind. The mistranslated clause was not small. It was not cosmetic. It changed ownership rights, future licensing authority, and control of the very technology the investors had spent months negotiating. A mistake like that could destroy trust before a single signature touched paper. She reached the service counter and placed the tray down carefully. Around her, kitchen staff moved with practiced rhythm. Plates emerged beneath warming lights. Orders were called out. Coffee machines hissed softly. Yet Maya barely heard any of it. Her attention remained fixed on the private dining room beyond the glass partition. Most people assumed intelligence announced itself loudly. Degrees on walls. Titles on business cards. Expensive offices overlooking skylines. Maya had learned something different. Real intelligence often sat quietly because it did not need permission to exist. Back in the dining room, Adrian continued steering the conversation with the confidence of a man who rarely faced resistance. Investors listened. Executives nodded. Lawyers reviewed documents. Everything appeared smooth on the surface. Yet the Japanese executive who had mentioned the translation issue still seemed uneasy. He exchanged another look with his colleague before lowering his voice. Maya understood every word. The concern had not disappeared. It had grown. Adrian noticed the hesitation. "Is there a problem?" he asked. The executive offered a polite smile. "Nothing significant. Just reviewing language details." Adrian waved a dismissive hand. "Legal teams always find something to worry about." Several guests chuckled. The tension eased for a moment. But not for Maya. She knew exactly which phrase they were discussing. She had encountered similar terminology years earlier while studying international patent agreements through online university lectures, hundreds of late nights, thousands of pages. Knowledge gathered one quiet hour at a time while the rest of the city slept. A manager passed by carrying a tablet. "Table 12 needs another bottle of sparkling water," he said. Maya nodded automatically. Her body followed routine. Her mind stayed fixed on the contract. She returned to the private room, carrying a fresh bottle. The discussion had shifted toward projected revenues. $800 million. Then $1 billion over the following decade. Numbers floated across the table like they belonged to another universe. Yet one incorrect sentence threatened all of it. Maya carefully refilled glasses. No one acknowledged her presence. No one except Adrian, who briefly glanced her way. "At least someone in this room looks relaxed," he said casually. More laughter followed. Maya offered a professional smile. Nothing more. The investors returned to their conversation. Then the Japanese executive spoke again, this time with greater concern. His voice remained calm, but Maya caught the subtle shift beneath it. The kind of shift that appears when experienced professionals realize a problem may be larger than they first believed. Papers were exchanged. Screens were rotated. Advisors leaned closer. The room began tightening around an invisible knot. Adrian's confidence remained intact, but impatience crept into his expression. He disliked uncertainty. He disliked delays even more. Outside, the Chicago skyline glowed beneath the night sky. Traffic moved like ribbons of red and white light along distant streets. Inside, silence gradually replaced small talk. The room no longer felt like a celebration. It felt like an examination. Maya stood near the wall waiting for instructions. She watched the executives review the disputed paragraph again. Watched them struggle to reconcile two completely different interpretations. Watched uncertainty spread through people who were accustomed to certainty. Then she noticed something else. The translation itself was not the original source of the problem. A secondary reference document contained an even larger error, one hidden beneath legal terminology, complicated enough to escape casual review. Her heart began beating faster. This was no longer a single mistake. It was a chain reaction waiting to happen. She looked around the room. Billionaires, attorneys, analysts, consultants, some of the most highly compensated minds in the industry. Yet none of them seemed to see what she saw. For a moment, Maya considered staying silent. It would be safer, easier, expected. Then she remembered something her grandmother used to tell her. Truth does not become less true because the wrong person speaks it. And as the debate intensified around the table, Maya realized the moment she had been avoiding was no longer approaching. It had arrived. The debate had reached the point where expensive confidence began sounding suspiciously like confusion. Papers shifted across the table. Legal advisors whispered to one another. Screens filled with highlighted passages and annotated comments. The atmosphere that had felt celebratory an hour earlier now carried the weight of uncertainty. Adrian Cole sat motionless, but anyone paying attention could see the subtle tension forming around his eyes. He built his reputation on seeing opportunities before anyone else. Tonight, for the first time, he looked like a man searching for answers instead of providing them. Maya stood near the edge of the room, holding an untouched bottle of mineral water. Her pulse echoed in her ears. Every instinct told her to stay quiet. People in her position were not expected to interrupt negotiations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. They were expected to disappear into the background, to refill glasses, to clear plates, to remain invisible. Yet invisibility had always been a strange thing. People ignored you until the moment you became impossible to ignore. Across the table, the Japanese executive adjusted his glasses and pointed toward a paragraph on the digital display. His expression remained professional, but concern lingered beneath the surface. The attorneys continued debating terminology. One interpretation suggested shared ownership. Another suggested exclusive control. Both could not be correct. And buried beneath those competing interpretations was the second error Maya had noticed, the one nobody seemed to see, the one capable of turning a disagreement into a disaster. She took a slow breath, then another. Her grandmother's words returned again. Truth does not care who delivers it. The room grew quieter. Frustration replaced confidence. Questions replaced answers. Finally, before she could lose her nerve, Maya spoke. Her voice was calm, respectful, barely above conversational volume. "Excuse me." The single phrase seemed to freeze the room. Heads turned. Conversation stopped. A dozen pairs of eyes landed on her at once. Adrian blinked, surprised that the waitress had interrupted. One attorney frowned. Another looked confused. The silence stretched longer than anyone intended. Maya immediately felt the weight of every stare. But she did not retreat. "I apologize for interrupting," she said carefully. "I believe the problem may not be the translation itself." The statement landed harder than she expected. One executive actually lowered his pen. Another leaned back in his chair. Adrian stared at her as though seeing her for the first time. "What do you mean?" he asked. His tone was not hostile. It was cautious. Maya stepped closer to the display screen. "The disputed phrase is creating confusion," she said. "But the larger issue is in the reference document attached to Section 7. Several attorneys exchanged puzzled glances. One immediately opened the supporting files. Maya continued. "The licensing language references a prior patent framework. The Japanese translation follows that framework correctly. The secondary document does not." More silence. Fingers moved rapidly across keyboards. Pages turned. Advisors searched through digital records. Then something changed. A senior attorney stopped typing. His eyes narrowed. He reviewed the section again. And again. The color drained slightly from his face. "Wait," he muttered. Another lawyer leaned over his shoulder. Seconds later, she reacted the same way. The room began shifting. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like a compass needle finding true north. The Japanese executive spoke to a colleague in rapid Japanese. Maya understood every word. They were not questioning her observation. They were confirming it. Adrian looked from the lawyers to Maya and back again. His confidence had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something rarer. Curiosity. "How do you know this?" he asked. Maya hesitated. The answer sounded ridiculous even to her. Years of self-study. Public library books. Online lectures watched after midnight. Language courses completed during lunch breaks. Legal journals read on crowded train rides home. Thousands of hours nobody ever noticed. "I read a lot," she answered simply. The room remained silent for another moment. Then the senior attorney cleared his throat. "She is right." 3 words. That was all it took. The entire atmosphere changed. Executives straightened in their chairs. Advisors reopened files. Investors exchanged stunned looks. The hidden error was real. More importantly, the waitress had found it before any of them. Adrian stared at Maya as if the room itself had tilted beneath his feet. Just 30 minutes earlier, he had joked about her understanding intelligence. Now some of the most educated professionals in the room were reviewing a problem she had solved first. And for the first time that night, nobody laughed. The silence that followed felt heavier than the Chicago skyline outside the windows. Nobody reached for a glass. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody made a joke. For several long seconds, the only sound came from the distant string quartet playing somewhere beyond the private dining hall. The music felt strangely disconnected from reality, as if it belonged to another room, another night, another story entirely. Adrian Cole remained seated, his eyes fixed on Maya. Moments earlier, she had been part of the background. Now she stood at the center of a conversation worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The shift was subtle but undeniable. Power had not changed hands, but attention had. And attention is often where power begins. The senior attorney reviewed the document one more time before removing his glasses. If this had gone forward unchanged, he said carefully, the ownership dispute could have surfaced after implementation. Another lawyer nodded. Possibly. Within the first 18 months. A third added, the litigation risk alone would have been enormous. The words landed like quiet thunder. No shouting. No panic. Just the growing realization that a mistake hidden in plain sight had nearly survived review by an entire team of experts. Across the table, several investors exchanged concerned looks. One of them spoke in Japanese. Maya understood immediately. They were discussing whether the oversight would have damaged trust between both companies. The answer was yes. Absolutely yes. Trust, once broken, rarely returns in its original form. Adrian folded his hands together. His expression remained controlled, but something had changed behind his eyes. The certainty that had defined him all evening was being replaced by something more complicated. Respect was beginning to compete with pride. You said the translation was not the real issue, he said. You found the source document problem instead. Maya nodded. The translation followed the original framework correctly. The attached licensing reference did not. One of the international investors leaned forward. You understood all of that from listening? Maya hesitated. Every eye in the room turned toward her again. The question felt larger than it sounded, because what they were really asking was not how she found the mistake. They were asking how a waitress found it before everyone else. I recognize the terminology, she replied. I studied similar agreements before. A few eyebrows rose immediately. The answer only created more questions. Adrian noticed the reaction. Studied where? He asked. Maya looked down briefly before answering. Mostly on my own. The room fell quiet again. Self-taught. Two simple words. Yet in a room filled with elite universities, executive titles, and framed credentials, they carried unexpected weight. One investor smiled slightly. Another looked genuinely impressed. The attorneys exchanged glances that bordered on disbelief. Years of assumptions were colliding with reality in real time. Adrian leaned back slowly. For the first time all evening, he appeared less interested in the contract and more interested in the person standing beside it. How many languages do you speak? He asked. Maya had not expected that question. 6 fluently, she answered. A few others conversationally. A fork slipped from someone's hand and clinked softly against a plate. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody doubted her. The evidence was standing right in front of them. The Japanese executive smiled for the first time that evening and spoke directly to her in Japanese. Maya answered immediately without hesitation. The exchange flowed naturally, effortlessly. Several people stared in disbelief. Then another investor switched to Mandarin. Maya responded again. Perfectly. The reaction around the table spread like a ripple through water. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Advisors whispered. One executive actually shook his head as though trying to reconcile what he was witnessing with what he thought he knew about the world. Adrian remained silent. Not because he lacked words. Because too many words were arriving at once. He remembered the joke he had made earlier. The casual dismissal. The easy assumption. It sounded different now. Smaller somehow. Across the city, thousands of lights sparkled beneath the night sky. Inside the dining room, a different kind of illumination was taking place. Not the kind created by chandeliers or skyline reflections. The kind created when a false perception finally gives way to truth. And as the conversation gradually resumed, nobody looked at Maya the way they had an hour ago. The uniform was still the same. The tray was still in her hand. But the room had changed. Because once people see hidden value, pretending it does not exist becomes impossible. The atmosphere never fully returned to what it had been before. The contracts remained on the table. The investors remained in their seats. The deal still mattered. Yet something larger had entered the room. The illusion that intelligence always arrived wearing a tailored suit had quietly begun to fall apart. Maya could feel it in the way people looked at her now. Not with pity, not with indifference, with curiosity. And curiosity is often the first step toward respect. The dinner resumed, but the rhythm had changed. Questions. about licensing structures gave way to questions about language frameworks. Discussions about projected revenues drifted toward international markets. More than once, an executive glanced toward Maya before speaking, almost as if seeking confirmation that they had not overlooked something else. She found the attention uncomfortable, not because she disliked being acknowledged, because she had spent years learning how to survive without acknowledgement. Attention was unfamiliar territory. Adrian noticed that too. He watched her quietly as conversations moved around the table. The more he observed, the more puzzled he became. Nothing about her behavior suggested someone seeking recognition. She had not interrupted to impress anyone. She had not exaggerated her expertise. She had not tried to seize the spotlight after proving herself right. If anything, she seemed eager for the evening to return to normal. That realization bothered him more than he expected. Most people in his world competed endlessly for visibility. Promotions, titles, influence, status. Entire careers were built on being seen. Yet the person who had just protected an $800 million negotiation seemed perfectly content returning to work. Finally, Adrian spoke again. "Where did you learn Japanese?" Maya set down a water pitcher before answering. "Public library books at first." Several guests smiled, assuming she was joking. She was not. Then online courses, language exchange groups, recorded lectures. Adrian raised an eyebrow. And Mandarin? Similar process. And the legal terminology? Research papers, patent journals, open university programs. The answers came calmly, almost casually. Yet each one landed harder than the last. Around the table sat graduates from some of the most prestigious institutions in the country. They had spent fortunes on education. Maya had built hers from determination, discipline, and whatever resources she could access after long work shifts. One investor shook his head in disbelief. "Why are you working here?" The question escaped before he could stop it. Several people immediately looked uncomfortable. It sounded rude, but it was also honest. Maya smiled faintly. "Because bills still arrive every month." A few guests laughed softly. Not at her, at the truth. She continued. "Knowledge does not automatically create opportunity. Sometimes it just creates possibilities. Then you spend years trying to turn those possibilities into something real." The room grew thoughtful. Those words carried the weight of experience. Adrian found himself studying her more carefully than ever. He had spent years evaluating talent. He could identify potential in companies within minutes. Yet somehow he had completely failed to recognize it standing 5 feet away. The realization felt uncomfortably personal. One of the international investors leaned forward. "You should be advising companies, not serving tables." Maya offered a polite smile. "Maybe someday." Her answer carried no bitterness. No resentment, just patience. The kind of patience built through years of hearing no before eventually hearing yes. The discussion shifted back toward business. But now something unexpected happened. When questions involving international regulations emerged, several executives began asking Maya for clarification. Not formally, not as an employee, as someone whose perspective had earned credibility. Each answer she provided was concise, precise, helpful. Slowly, the remaining tension surrounding the agreement disappeared. The hidden error was corrected. The licensing language was revised. What had begun as a potential disaster transformed into a stronger deal than the one originally planned. Outside, the city lights stretched endlessly beneath the night sky. Midnight approached. Staff members quietly prepared for closing procedures. The evening was nearing its end. Yet Adrian sensed the most important part had not happened yet. Because contracts could be fixed, mistakes could be corrected, numbers could be renegotiated. But there was another issue sitting quietly at the center of the table, one that could not be solved with attorneys or revised documents. Earlier that night, he had measured Maya before he knew anything about her. He had reduced her to a role, a uniform, an assumption, and now every success she revealed felt like a mirror, reflecting his own failure to see clearly. For the first time in a very long time, Adrian Cole was not questioning a business strategy. He was questioning himself. The dinner should have ended with signatures, handshakes, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Instead, it ended with something far rarer. Reflection. The final revisions were completed just after midnight. Attorneys confirmed the corrected language. Investors reviewed the updated terms one last time. What had nearly become a costly misunderstanding was now resolved. The agreement remained intact. The partnership survived. and everyone in the room knew why. Maya collected empty glasses from the far end of the table while executives discussed next steps. The work itself had not changed. She still moved quietly, still carried trays, still performed the same duties she had arrived to perform hours earlier. Yet the room no longer treated her like part of the furniture. People thanked her. They looked her in the eye. Some even introduced themselves before leaving. Small gestures, simple courtesies, the kind that cost nothing but somehow mean everything. Adrian remained seated after most of the discussion concluded. The skyline beyond the windows had grown darker. The city below seemed calmer now, wrapped in the deep blue stillness that arrives after midnight. For years he had believed success came from seeing what others missed. Market shifts, emerging technologies, untapped opportunities. Yet tonight exposed a different blind spot. The inability to recognize value when it arrived wearing ordinary clothes. He watched Maya clear the final section of the table. No audience remained. No investors were paying attention. No one was watching except him. And that made what happened next matter even more. Maya. She turned slightly. Yes, sir. The title felt strange to him now. Not because she said it disrespectfully. Because after everything he had learned, it no longer felt appropriate. Adrian stood from his chair. The room had grown quiet enough that several nearby guests noticed. One attorney paused while packing documents. An investor slowed his conversation. Nobody interrupted. Adrian took a slow breath. Public apologies are easy when they serve a purpose. Genuine ones are harder because they require surrendering pride. Earlier tonight, he said, I made assumptions about you that were unfair. Maya listened without speaking. I judged you before I knew anything about you. The room grew even quieter. And I was wrong. 3 words. Simple, direct, honest. Maya looked at him for a moment. Not triumphantly, not bitterly, just thoughtfully. She had spent years hearing people underestimate her. Most never acknowledged it afterward. Most protected their pride more fiercely than the truth. Thank you, she said softly. That was all. No speech, no lecture, no attempt to embarrass him. Just grace. The response somehow made the moment more powerful. One investor smiled quietly. Another lowered his eyes as though reflecting on his own assumptions. Adrian nodded. He expected relief after apologizing. Instead, he felt something deeper. Humility. The recognition that intelligence, talent, and character are often hidden beneath surfaces people never bother to examine. You saved this deal tonight, he said. Maya shook her head. The attorneys fixed it. Adrian almost laughed. Even now she was redirecting credit. You found it first. For the first time that evening, Maya seemed unsure how to respond. Outside, the lights of Chicago shimmered across the lake like scattered stars. Inside, the final guests began gathering their belongings. The night was ending. Yet one question remained in Adrian's mind. A question that refused to leave. Not about contracts. Not about international markets. Not about revenue projections. About potential. About opportunity. About how many other people like Maya existed in the world, overlooked because someone decided their uniform told their entire story. As staff members quietly prepared the room for closing, Adrian realized this dinner had produced 2 outcomes instead of 1. The first was a successful partnership worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The second was far more personal. A lesson no business school had ever taught him. The most expensive mistakes are not always found in contracts. Sometimes they are found in the assumptions we make about other people. The last investors departed shortly after 12:30 in the morning. Handshakes were exchanged. Elevators opened and closed. Conversations faded into the distance. One by one, the people who had filled the private dining room with ambition, confidence, and assumptions disappeared into the Chicago night. Soon only a handful of staff members remained. Candles were extinguished. Chairs were pushed neatly beneath tables. The skyline still glittered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the room itself felt different now. Quieter, more honest. Maya gathered the final stack of menus and carried them toward the service station. Her shift was almost over. In another 30 minutes, she would take the train home, review language exercises before bed, and wake up a few hours later to begin again. It was not glamorous. It was not easy, but it was her life. Consistent effort. Small progress. One day at a time. She had learned long ago that extraordinary outcomes are often built from ordinary routines repeated without applause. As she reached the service counter, she heard footsteps approaching behind her. Adrian. He was no longer surrounded by advisors or executives. No audience remained. No cameras. No performance. Just two people standing in a nearly empty dining room. "Do you have a few minutes?" he asked. Maya looked surprised. "A few." Adrian nodded toward a nearby table overlooking the city. "Would you sit down?" For a brief moment she hesitated. Then she placed the menus aside and took a seat. The contrast would have seemed impossible earlier that evening. A billionaire chief executive officer and a waitress sitting across from each other after midnight, discussing life instead of contracts. Yet somehow it felt natural. Adrian folded his hands together. "I keep thinking about something you said." Maya looked curious. "Which part?" "Knowledge creates possibilities. Then you spend years turning those possibilities into something real." She smiled faintly. "That sounds like something I would say." Adrian nodded. "Most people spend their careers chasing opportunities. You spent yours preparing for them." The observation lingered between them. Maya stared briefly at the city lights beyond the glass. "Preparation is the only thing I can control," she said quietly. "Opportunities arrive when they want to." Adrian understood that answer more than she realized. His own success had often been attributed to brilliance. People rarely saw the years behind it. The failures, the sacrifices, the discipline. For the first time all evening, he recognized a familiar trait in her. Persistence, the kind that survives disappointment. "Have you ever considered consulting?" he asked. Maya laughed softly. "Every month." "I am serious." "So am I." They both smiled. Then Adrian reached into his jacket and removed a business card. Not the standard company card handed out at conferences. A private one. Direct contact information. Personal email. Personal phone number. He placed it on the table between them. Maya looked at it, but did not touch it immediately. "What is this?" she asked. "An invitation." Adrian's voice was calm. "Not a favor. Not charity. An opportunity to have a conversation about your future." Maya remained silent. He continued. "You earned that tonight." Outside, a passing train traced a ribbon of light through the darkness below. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Maya carefully picked up the card. Not with excitement. Not with disbelief. With quiet consideration. The way someone handles a door that may finally be opening after years of knocking. Adrian stood. "Whatever you decide, do not let anyone convince you that your value depends on whether they recognize it." Maya looked up at him. "That includes billionaires?" A smile crossed his face. "Especially billionaires." For the first time that night, they laughed together. Not as a chief executive officer and a waitress. Not as a powerful man and an overlooked woman. Just as two people who had learned something important. And as the final lights dimmed across the dining room, both understood that the most meaningful partnerships are not always written into contracts. Sometimes they begin the moment one person finally sees another clearly. 3 days later, the city looked exactly the same. Traffic flowed through downtown streets. Commuters filled train platforms. Coffee shops opened before sunrise. Chicago moved forward with its usual relentless rhythm. Yet for Maya, something had changed. The business card remained tucked carefully inside a notebook on her kitchen table. She had looked at it dozens of times. Not because she was impressed by the title printed on it. Because opportunities have a strange way of creating doubt. Even when people spend years preparing for them. Especially then. Her apartment was small but orderly. Books occupied nearly every available shelf. Language dictionaries sat beside economics textbooks. Legal reference guides rested next to notebooks filled with handwritten observations. Nothing in the room suggested luxury. Everything suggested discipline. Maya sat at the table reviewing a Mandarin article before leaving for work. The same routine. The same determination. Yet every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the card. She still had not called. Not because she lacked courage. Because she wanted to be certain she was walking toward something real rather than simply reacting to a remarkable evening. Meanwhile, across the city, Adrian Cole found himself doing something unusual. He was thinking less about markets and more about people. The merger had generated headlines throughout the business community. Analysts praised the agreement. Investors celebrated the projected growth. Several executives congratulated him on navigating the negotiation successfully. None of them knew how close the deal had come to unraveling. And none of them knew who had actually spotted the problem first. Adrian considered sharing the story publicly more than once. Yet something stopped him. Recognition should belong to the person who earned it, not the executive who tells the story. So instead, He asked his team a simple question. How many applicants have we overlooked because their resume did not match our expectations? The room had gone quiet. Nobody possessed an immediate answer. That silence bothered him, because it suggested the question mattered. For days after the dinner, Maya finally sent an email. Short, professional, direct. She thanked Adrian for the conversation and agreed to meet. Nothing more. No dramatic language. No emotional speech. Just a willingness to explore possibility. Adrian smiled when he read it. The meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday. Not at corporate headquarters. Not in a towering executive boardroom. At a small conference center near the Chicago River. Neutral ground. When Tuesday arrived, Maya entered the building carrying the same calm posture she brought everywhere. The receptionist greeted her warmly. No one seemed surprised to see her. No one questioned whether she belonged there. Small details. Important details. Adrian was already waiting when she arrived, along with 3 senior executives from different divisions of the company. Maya immediately recognized that this was not a courtesy meeting. It was an evaluation, not of her intelligence, that had already been established, of her thinking, her perspective, her ability to solve problems in real time. The discussion lasted nearly 3 hours. International expansion, cross-cultural communication, regulatory challenges, artificial intelligence ethics, workforce development, topic after topic, question after question. Maya answered thoughtfully, sometimes immediately, sometimes after careful reflection. She did not pretend to know everything. When she lacked information, she said so. When she had an opinion, she supported it with reasoning. By the second hour, the executives had stopped interviewing her. They were discussing ideas with her. By the third hour, they were taking notes. Adrian noticed the shift happening again. The same shift he had witnessed during the dinner. People entering the conversation with assumptions and leaving with respect. When the meeting finally ended, one executive remained seated for several seconds after Maya left the room. Then he turned toward Adrian. How exactly did we not know about her? Adrian looked through the glass wall as Maya walked toward the elevator. Because we were looking at the wrong things. The answer lingered long after the room became silent. And somewhere beyond the windows, the city continued moving forward, unaware that another door had just begun to open. 2 weeks later, Maya stood once again in front of the Chicago skyline. But this time she was not carrying a tray. She was carrying a visitor badge. The glass tower of Coal Dynamics reflected the morning sun across the river like a wall of light. Employees moved through the lobby with purpose. Elevators opened and closed. Conversations echoed softly across marble floors. Everything felt familiar and completely different at the same time. The offer had arrived 3 days after the meeting. Not a favor. Not a symbolic gesture. A real position. International strategy analyst. Competitive salary. Full benefits. Access to projects involving global partnerships and multilingual market development. Maya had read the offer letter 4 times before believing it was real. Then she accepted. Not because it guaranteed success. Because it created a chance. And chances were what she had been preparing for her entire life. On her first day, Adrian greeted her personally in the lobby. The gesture surprised several employees. Executives rarely welcomed new hires themselves. But Adrian no longer cared about appearances as much as he once had. Some lessons are too important to ignore once they are learned. Ready? He asked. Maya smiled. As ready as anyone can be on the first day. Together they stepped into the elevator. 30 floors above the city, a new chapter began. The transition was not effortless. New responsibilities arrived quickly. Meetings, research projects, international conference calls, complex negotiations involving multiple countries and languages. Yet Maya adapted the same way she had always adapted. By learning, by listening, by doing the work. Within months, her reports were circulating among senior leadership teams. Her recommendations improved communication with overseas partners. Her cultural analysis prevented misunderstandings that could have delayed major initiatives. More importantly, she brought something impossible to quantify. Perspective. The ability to see beyond assumptions. The ability to recognize value where others overlooked it. One afternoon, nearly 6 months after the dinner, Adrian entered a conference room during a strategic planning session. Executives from multiple divisions filled the table. At the far end sat Maya presenting recommendations for a new international expansion project. The room listened carefully. Questions were thoughtful. Notes were taken. Ideas were debated. Nobody saw a former waitress. They saw an expert. Adrian paused near the doorway without interrupting. For a moment, he simply observed. Then he remembered the first time he had seen her. Not really seen her, merely looked at her. The difference between those two things suddenly felt enormous. After the meeting ended, one of the newer executives approached Maya. "Where did you get your education?" he asked. The question sounded familiar. Maya smiled. "Everywhere I could." The executive laughed softly before realizing she was serious. Later that evening, after most employees had gone home, Adrian stood alone by the window overlooking the city. The same city where a single assumption had nearly cost him more than money. He thought about the dinner, the contract, the mistake hidden inside legal language. But most of all, he thought about the lesson that followed. Success had taught him many things: revenue, leadership, strategy, risk. Yet one of the most important lessons arrived from someone carrying a tray in a restaurant high above Chicago. Maya eventually passed his office on her way out. "Good night," she said. Adrian smiled. "Good night, Maya." She continued toward the elevators, disappearing around the corner. The city lights flickered beyond the glass as evening settled across the skyline. Somewhere below, thousands of people hurried through their own stories, carrying talents, dreams, and possibilities the world might never notice. And that was the truth at the heart of everything. The most valuable people in a room are not always the loudest, not always the richest, not always the ones sitting at the head of the table. Sometimes they are the ones everyone else overlooks, until the moment they speak. And when that moment comes, the room is never quite the same again.